And I think it's our duty as leaders to take those stands, because that's what builds the framework for future decision making. When you see senior leaders in your organization who take those kinds of stands, when it's your turn to make a decision, then you're going to go back to that framework, that reference framework, and decide how those decisions are going to be made. And I think that's how we have to do it. Others want to comment on it?
I mean, gray areas. I think that my colleagues in the apparel industry have shared with me a number of gray areas for them. A colleague at Levi said that prior to the Rana Plaza issue in Bangladesh, they had actually done audits of their suppliers and engaged with the government in very uncomfortable conversations and ended up pulling most of their business out of the country. I believe it was in Bangladesh. Also in Cambodia, they've had similar conversations where they've said, if you don't bring the factories and the workers' conditions up to certain standards, we'll have to pull our business. And that's very noble, right? It's the right thing to do. But on the flip side, what happens to those workers, right? Well, some other company from another country may not have the same standards and may very well employ them perhaps in worse conditions and lower wages, or they may not be employed at all. Look at child labor. I think we all agree that child labor is reprehensible. Children belong in school. The reality is, in many parts of the world where people are living on 50 cents a day, children are seen as having to contribute to the family's livelihood. Child labor is horrible, but at the end of the day, if you don't, if you're in indigenous factories don't employ children or in farms, et cetera, if they're not working, the reality is they're not going to be in school. That's not the alternative. So what can business and government do together to figure out alternatives? Because it's not as simple as saying you will not employ child labor, or you will give your workers, this wage and this many hours in these conditions. That's fine. But there needs to be more wraparound services, more engagement beyond thou shalt not do.
This question is related to the examples you've given, Paula, about situations in which host country governments don't have the capacity to provide clear guidance. And I think those are one of the most challenging situations. There's one viewpoint which says that yes, corporations should provide more of these services that government can provide. But there's also another viewpoint that says they should not, because do we want to, have corporations control those kinds of services that we would rather manage through the political process? Examples are companies that, oil companies that sometimes are in communities where they wind up running hospitals, and that's just not their expertise. So my question to you is, do you have any success stories about what works in terms of working with foreign governments to build those capabilities? And are there cases where you sometimes deliberately refuse to take on those responsibilities and rather try and push the government towards doing that? And what works?
It's challenging. I mean, we may have a few good examples. Part of the problem, there are a couple of aspects there. For oil and gas companies, very often into your production sharing agreement, the government will build in, you need to build so many roads, you need to build and run a hospital, schools, et cetera, because they want to make sure that at least some of the resources go to that. And it does put us in a very difficult position of almost taking on a quasi-government role, which is not where I don't think business should be. We're oil and gas people. We don't have those skills yet, so it's a constant engagement. I think there are a couple of interesting examples now. A lot of countries, particularly countries that are newer to the oil patch, that have newer resources to develop, are beginning to engage both legally and in other ways with companies around the issue of building local capacity in the supply chain. Countries like Ghana, for example, have passed legislation requiring international operators to source locally at a pretty ambitious level within 5 or so years of operating, which I think is great. So I think that in the first instance, there's an opportunity for companies to move from a philanthropy model. When you move into, if you're going to be building a school or a road, that's nice, but building the capacity of local business is better. Because the power of your supply chain to create sustainable economic development and lift people's incomes is far greater than any philanthropy program, no matter how well conceived and effective. So I think that that's a great opportunity. We've done some work, we work in Equatorial Guinea, which is a very, very challenging environment, and we've spent a lot of time with our colleagues in the government helping them engage with the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. And it's been a long road for them, and their country's first application, unfortunately, was not successful. But I think that engagement over time, we've seen kind of an evolution in our government counterparts around business and ethics. Has it been a radical change? Maybe not, but there's definitely some change up front, and that's a good thing. But those conversations are also very hard to have. Much easier to build a hospital than to build the capacity of a small enterprise, or ensure that they have access to capital, or a legal framework that enables small business to thrive. So thank you for asking the question.
Hi, Tom Van from the Supplier Data Exchange. And earlier this morning we heard about the need to pre-screen suppliers or vendors or contractors, and you sort of alluded to ethical audits that were done by Levi's. And I was wondering, is this really the best model that's available? Self-assessment questionnaires, ethical audits, and not, in the case of not being on the ground or where the government can't monitor, or is there something else better out there that we're just not looking at because we haven't discovered it yet?
Now, I know there's, when you're talking about tools, there's quite a bit of tools that are out there, but they're only as good as the people who are behind them monitoring them and actually following up. We can identify a lot of ethical issues throughout multiple supply chains, but now it's time to get on the ground and get in there to do something about it and rectify the issue. It's easy to say that we're just going to cut them off, but in a supply chain, it has to be very dynamic, and it still involves people, and I think that's the dilemma that we have as we progress into now 2014. We have all these great analytical tools to look at these situations, but I'm still in the camp where you physically have to be on the ground and still do that legwork to find out what's actually happening. So what has to happen, I believe, throughout your entire supply chain, those tools need to be integrated throughout. So if you're the supplier that's on the top, sort of looking at all your suppliers that are providing these services and or materials, those suppliers that are in your supply chain contractually should have the same access and the same tools that you're, in a sense, auditing them. So the person that's at the very beginning of the supply chain should have the same analytical tools that the conglomerate is actually looking at, and everyone in between. So that, to me, is the best way of doing it. Now, what is that tool? Well, there's obviously quite a few of them, and they also have to be pretty much integrated across multiple supply chains as well. So what I'll do in the fall is I'll pose that to my MBA students and say, guess what, I got a project for you. But no, it's something that is extremely important, but it does require a lot of human intervention in that process.
I think it's easier, big corporation to do the traditional audit type work. I think it becomes a lot more challenging when you're dealing with a local entity, a small business enterprise that doesn't have the same amount of resources, the same amount of law department, the same amount of environmental department you have. And how do you engage with that smaller business, that entrepreneur, to ensure that they're getting their fair shake at growing their business along with you? And I think at the end of the day, it's boots on the ground. You actually have to spend physical time. It's not just check the box. It's sit down with them. It's go through their business and really get to know those suppliers, and then say, okay, we're going to extend a degree of trust here. We know you don't have these resources. We're going to give it a try. Well, where we go. And that's particularly important when you're trying to embrace local work around your projects. I think we heard about it in foreign countries. It's just as important if you're in Newark or Philadelphia or wherever, that you're reaching out to your local potential suppliers who are employing people who impact your work, your job. you get yourself out there and open yourself up to that kind of different exposure than a big corporation to another big corporation.
I know we've had similar circumstances. Most of our government contracts have a requirement for us to use a certain amount of smaller contractors, and many times they don't have all of the capacity and expertise that they need for a given contract. And we actually work alongside them to help them build capacity and or to bolster their capability. So in addition to meeting the requirements of a given project or contract, we're also helping them build capacity over time. And that, you know, there's benefit for us in that as well, because then they become a more reliable and consistent contractor over time. It's very painful for us if we do have breakdowns in our supply chain and we've got contractors who can follow through and deliver what needs to be delivered. So there's a benefit to us as well, but it's a lot of work.
Yeah, I mean, we've even had situations where we had contractors, me flipping back to the, when I was in procurement and supply chain, where we felt that their margins weren't enough, meaning that we were getting a great price, but we said to ourselves as professionals, there's absolutely no way that this company is going to be able to survive. They can't make a profit. Where we then brought them in and sat down and talked to them about, you know, the fact that, you know, you're really at the margins here. And we're going to renegotiate the contract in a sense to bump it up, because we can't lose a valuable, good small supplier based on the fact that you're really trying to please us to keep your prices low. And because how we were able to identify that, the services started to slip a little bit, and there were things that were happening that weren't being very responsive. The ethical thing was obviously to go in and find out what was going on with the company, but it came to pass that it wasn't a good contract. We weren't paying them what we considered to be not only a living wage, but it wasn't competitive with the market. So again, getting into the field and looking at what's happening within your supply chain can go both ways. Not squeezing folks down to the point where they can't make a decent living, but it also is the responsibility of leaders to also look at suppliers to build them up and to make sure that they're strong enough to be competitive not only with you, but you know, across the board as well, and how well their workers are being trained, as well as being integrated into the profits of that company. And that gets back to the gray areas as well, so how much profit is a good profit. I mean, if you have you know, companies who are, you know, doing really well with the ethical issues, then well, how come that's not, you know, transitioning down into the workforce? And those are issues, again, from a supply chain perspective. We're looking at what is the ultimate the goal, which is the product, if it is a product that's being delivered, and then breaking that down to find out, okay, what is happening along the path to bring that product to bear, and are all the players within that process, all the companies and all the people being taken care of properly. Ultimately, we got a great product, and we're very proud about the fact that we got it, but what is happening along that supply chain in order for us to have that